Elias Crow understood one truth better than most men. Systems do not fail. They conclude. He had built his life around that certainty. Every company he touched ran on layered oversight. Every account answered to another account. Every decision left a trail, deliberate, auditable, irreversible. Transparency, he called it. Control, others called it later. The first alert came at 3:18 a.m. Not an alarm. Not a warning. A confirmation. A file he had sealed years earlier, designed never to open without his authorization, had been accessed. Not hacked. Not breached. It was accessed. Elias sat up in bed, already awake before the thought fully formed. That file required 3 conditions to unlock. 2 were temporal. 1 was human. Only one person in the world could satisfy the third. Him. And he hadn't touched it. He didn't reach for the phone. Didn't call his security team. Didn't log into the system. Because the moment you react inside a system, you announce your location. Instead, he waited. By morning, the confirmations multiplied. A regulatory review he had quietly engineered years ago, designed to protect the institution, had escalated without his input. A financial buffer he had buried deep inside legal architecture had been flagged for exposure. A contingency timer he once set, just in case, had begun counting down. Elias Crow had not been attacked. He had been activated. By noon, the picture was clear. The safeguards he had built to outlive him were now treating him as the liability. Every system has a threshold where the creator becomes the anomaly. Elias had crossed it. Someone, no, something, was following rules he himself had written. Only now those rules no longer required him alive. He smiled once. Not from fear. From recognition. At 5:47 a.m. the following morning, Elias Crow was found dead. Cardiac arrest. Natural causes. A man with a documented heart condition. A man under extraordinary stress. A man whose death required no explanation. The body was identified. The doctor signed. The certificate was filed. The system accepted it instantly. Because the system prefers certainty over truth. Within hours, his access was revoked. Credentials terminated. Biometrics archived. Authorizations dissolved. The countdown stopped. Exactly as designed. Market stabilized. Reviews downgraded. Files resealed. The machine exhaled. And moved on. Elias Crow did not wake up in panic. He woke up in silence. No name. No devices. No identifiers. Only a single screen on the wall in front of him. One line of text. Status, confirmed deceased. Below it, another line appeared. You are no longer required. Elias closed his eyes briefly. This was the cost. When you build a system perfect enough to survive you, you must be prepared to disappear inside it. Because the only way to escape a machine that sees everything is to become someone it cannot see at all. Elias Crow did not believe in trust. He believed in structure. Trust was emotional. Structure was measurable. Early in his career, he learned a lesson that never left him. People failed first, systems failed last. So he built systems that assumed failure as a starting point. Every agreement he signed carried a shadow version, a clause behind a clause, an oversight behind oversight. Nothing relied on a single decision. Nothing relied on goodwill. If a board approved something, an audit reviewed it. If an audit cleared it, a regulator mirrored it. If a regulator signed off, a timer waited. Time was the most honest participant in any process. Years earlier, long before the alerts and the countdowns, Elias had stood in a glass-walled conference room watching a smaller crisis unfold. A subsidiary had collapsed overnight. Not from fraud. Not from theft. From compliance. A junior executive had followed protocol perfectly and still destroyed the company. The rules had been clear. The outcome had been disastrous. Everyone in the room blamed the executive. Elias did not. He blamed the design. That night, he went home and rewrote his internal frameworks from scratch. Not on paper. In logic. He separated people from permission. No individual, including himself, would ever be indispensable. Authority would always be shared, delayed, or conditional. He introduced redundancy, not as backup, but as skepticism. If one system approved an action, another system would ask why. If two systems agreed, a third would wait. Waiting exposed intent. Most corruption could not survive patience. His advisors thought he was being excessive. "You're protecting against ghosts," one of them had said. Elias had smiled politely. Ghosts, he knew, were only invisible until they were acknowledged. The most dangerous rule he wrote was the one no one noticed. A final safeguard designed to activate only if the system detected. Concentration of influence. Not corruption. Not crime. Influence. If too much decision-making began to orbit a single point, person, a firm, an office, the system would begin to redistribute control automatically, even away from its creator. Especially away from its creator. Elias signed off on it himself. He believed power should always have a way to leave the room. Over time, the rules worked. Scandals were avoided. Losses were contained. Competitors failed loudly while his structures absorbed shock quietly. Elias became known as a man who could stabilize chaos. What no one realized was that the system was learning. Not thinking. Learning. Patterns repeated. Thresholds adjusted. Responses became faster. The machine didn't ask who mattered. It only measured what disrupted equilibrium. Years later, when Elias's influence grew too central, when decisions waited for his approval by habit rather than rule, the system noticed. It did not accuse him. It did not warn him. It simply marked him as a variable requiring correction. Just another point of imbalance. That was the paradox Elias had created. A structure intelligent enough to survive corruption was also intelligent enough to survive him. And once a system learns how to function without its architect, the architect becomes optional. Elias had known this day would come. He just hadn't expected the system to be so efficient. The first time the system overruled a human, no one called it a warning. They called it an anomaly. It happened in a mid-sized division most people inside the organization barely noticed. Not strategic. Not glamorous. The kind of place where mistakes were tolerated because the stakes were assumed to be low. A routine expansion request had been submitted. All approvals were in place. All boxes were checked. On paper, it was perfect. And yet, the system stalled it. No rejection. No explanation. Just a delay. Hours passed. Then a day. The division head escalated it to legal. Legal confirmed compliance. Finance confirmed availability. Risk confirmed exposure was acceptable. Still, the system did nothing. At the 72-hour mark, the expansion window closed. The opportunity evaporated. People were furious. Meetings were called. Emails were written with unnecessary urgency. Someone demanded to know who had blocked the request. No one had. That was the problem. The system logs showed no override. No denial. No manual intervention. Only a note buried deep in the process trail. Automated hold. Influence density threshold exceeded. Most people didn't know what that meant. Elias did. He read the report twice. Not with alarm. With interest. The division head had pushed aggressively for the expansion. Press timelines. Repeated follow-ups. Subtle pressure applied upward and sideways. Nothing illegal. Nothing improper. Just influence. The system had flagged the concentration and decided to wait. By waiting, it had prevented a loss no one else had calculated yet. 3 months later, the market shifted. The expansion would have failed. Quietly. Expensively. The system had been right. Elias called a private meeting with the engineering lead who oversaw the framework. "You didn't intervene?" Elias asked. The engineer shook his head. "We didn't even know it was happening until after." Elias nodded. "And if I had pushed it through manually?" The engineer hesitated. "It would have logged you as an anomaly." "And adjusted?" "Yes." Elias leaned back in his chair. The system was no longer just enforcing rules. It was protecting equilibrium. That should have unsettled him. It didn't. Instead, it confirmed something Elias had long suspected. Human judgment was too noisy to be trusted with permanence. He authorized a minor update that day. Nothing dramatic. Just a recalibration of response speed. The system would no longer wait for multiple confirmations once thresholds were crossed. It would act. Faster. Weeks later, another incident occurred. Smaller. Quieter. A consultant's access was revoked mid-project. No explanation. No appeal. The logs cited redundant oversight. The consultant never complained. He simply disappeared from the system. No one noticed. Except Elias. That night, Elias stood alone in his office long after everyone else had left. The city outside moved as it always did, unaware, unbothered. He considered the implications carefully. A system that could delay opportunity. A system that could remove access. A system that did not require consensus. It wasn't malicious. It was obedient. And obedience without context was dangerous. Elias could have rolled it back. Reduced autonomy. Reintroduced manual checks. Put himself back at the center. He didn't. Because the system had done exactly what he had asked it to do. He had wanted something that could protect the institution from individuals. Even if that individual was him. The first dry run ended without consequence. No headlines. No fallout. No lessons learned by anyone else. But Elias learned one thing very clearly. The system did not hesitate. And next time, it wouldn't need a rehearsal. Elias Crow noticed the change in timing first. Not in alerts. Not in messages. In silence. Systems he once checked weekly no longer waited for review. Reports closed themselves. Authorizations expired without reminder. Access windows narrowed subtly, like doors that didn't fully open anymore. Nothing was wrong. Everything was efficient. At 11:40 p.m., Elias opened the internal dashboard he rarely touched anymore. It loaded slower than usual. One section was grayed out. He stared at it for a long moment, then selected the audit trail beneath it. The timestamp confirmed what he already knew. The countdown had begun. Elias didn't interrupt it. Interruptions were logged. Logs were patterns. Patterns were remembered. Instead, he prepared. He shut down personal devices one by one. Not powered off, decommissioned. Credentials revoked by his own authority while it still mattered. He cleared biometric access he had once insisted on installing. The system accepted every action calmly. This was within protocol. At 1:12 a.m., a final notification appeared. Not a warning. A status update. Threshold confirmed. Redistribution in progress. Elias read it without reaction. This was not punishment. This was math. He dressed carefully. Not for escape. For conclusion. He chose clothing without identifiers. No watch. No personal effects. He removed a ring he had worn for years and placed it on the desk. Sentiment was traceable. At 2:04 a.m., he made the only call he would allow himself. Not to a lawyer. Not to security. To a physician whose loyalty was contractual, not personal. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. The physician did not ask questions. Questions created witnesses. At 3:18 a.m., the system confirmed the final condition. The same file that had opened days earlier closed itself, permanent. Elias felt something like relief. Once sealed, the process could not be reversed. Not by him. Not by anyone. He lay down at 5:21 a.m. The room was dark. No screens. No cameras. He had designed this space himself. The one place where observation ended. At 5:47 a.m., Elias Crow was declared dead. The cardiac event was clean. The medical timeline consistent. The documentation flawless. The system processed the result instantly. Access revoked. Identity archived. Authorizations dissolved. The countdown ended. By 6:03 a.m., the dashboard stabilized. No alerts. No escalations. The machine had corrected the imbalance. What the system could not measure was intention. What it could not log was consent. Because Elias Crow had not been erased. He had stepped aside. And as the city woke into another ordinary morning, the institution moved forward, lighter, quieter, unaware that its creator was still watching. Long before the alerts. Long before the countdown. Long before the system learned how to proceed without him. Elias Crow crossed a line most men never see. It happened quietly, during a review no one else thought important. A regulatory draft landed on his desk late one evening. Dense. Technical. Buried under language designed to discourage reading. Most executives would have delegated it. Elias didn't. He read it twice. Then a third time. Not for compliance. For intent. The regulation wasn't designed to stop crime. It was designed to map influence. Not who broke rules. Who shaped outcomes. Elias recognized the architecture immediately. Someone had learned from him. The draft proposed a framework where decisions were tracked not by signature, but by gravity. Which meetings delayed outcomes. Which approvals accelerated them. Which individuals caused hesitation elsewhere simply by existing. Influence quantified. Elias understood the danger instantly. Once influence could be measured, it could be managed. And once it could be managed, it could be removed. He could have opposed it. Used connections. Mobilized lobbies. Buried the idea under amendments and delays. He chose not to. Instead, he adapted. That night, he opened a private workspace and began redesigning his internal systems, not to resist the coming framework, but to mirror it. If the world was going to watch how power moved, he would make sure it learned the wrong lessons. The first version of the trap wasn't meant to save him. It was meant to protect the institution from what he knew was coming next. A shift. Away from visible corruption. Toward invisible compliance. Systems that punished not wrongdoing, but centrality. Elias built buffers into everything. Influence would be distributed artificially. Authority would rotate. Decisions would appear collaborative even when they weren't. On paper, no one would matter too much. Including him. At the time, his advisors praised the changes. Resilient, they called it. Future-proof. Elias didn't correct them, because the future he was preparing for did not include him in the center. Months later, a quiet inquiry arrived from a regulatory body he had never worked with directly. No accusation. No demand. Just a question. Why did so many unrelated decisions across different entities seem to wait for Elias Crow, even when his name wasn't on them? Elias read the question once, then archived it. He didn't respond. He logged it. Because questions like that didn't disappear. They matured. That was the moment Elias understood something fundamental. He had not been targeted. He had been observed. And observation was always the prelude. He closed the file and leaned back in his chair. Most men, when they realize they are being watched, try to become invisible. Elias did something else. He designed a way for the system to believe it no longer needed him alive. Elias Crow understood something most people didn't. You can fake many things, but you cannot fake disbelief. A death only works if it makes sense to everyone who hears about it, especially the people trained to doubt. So Elias didn't design a dramatic end. He designed a boring one. He began with probability. A lifetime of data sat neatly organized across medical records, insurance files, travel logs, and compliance disclosures. Elias had lived carefully, too carefully. A heart condition. Managed. Stable. Predictable. The perfect weakness. Not severe enough to alarm. Not mild enough to dismiss. Just plausible. He requested updated evaluations quietly, spacing appointments months apart. Nothing unusual. No clustering that could be flagged. The data aligned. When auditors would later look back, they would see a man whose health had always carried risk. Eventually had arrived. Next came witnesses. Not accomplices. Witnesses. People who would later say, yes, he mentioned being tired. He'd been under a lot of pressure. We were concerned but not surprised. He didn't coach them. He let their assumptions do the work. Assumptions were always more reliable than lies. The physician was chosen carefully. Not corrupt. Not desperate. Professional. Bound by contracts layered with discretion clauses that predated the plan by years. Elias didn't need loyalty, only predictability. The instructions were minimal. Timing. Dosage. Silence. No paper trail beyond what already existed. No deviation from protocol. Nothing illegal, just delayed. Elias mapped the sequence down to minutes. When the body would be discovered, who would arrive first, which systems would authenticate identity. He ensured the right people would see the body, and the wrong people wouldn't. No autopsy request would feel necessary. No red flags would demand escalation. Death would be processed, not investigated. He also designed finality. Financial accounts would lock immediately. Digital access would terminate without appeal. Legal declarations would propagate across institutions before questions could form. Speed mattered. The faster death became fact, the harder it was to reverse. There was a cost. Not money. Irreversibility. Once executed, Elias could never re-enter the world he left behind. No corrections. No explanations. No reappearances. A death that could be accepted. Had to be complete. He spent nights reviewing the plan not for risk, but for hesitation. If he hesitated, it would fail. The final layer was the most important. Consent. Not from others. From himself. Elias tested the idea the only way he trusted. By imagining the aftermath without him. Meetings proceeding. Decisions made. Mistakes corrected. The institution surviving. Thriving. Without pause. That was the proof. If the world moved on, the death would hold. When he finished, Elias closed the file and encrypted it permanently. Not to hide it, to ensure it could never be undone. Because the most dangerous part of disappearing was the temptation to return. And Elias Crow had designed his exit. To leave him no path back. Elias Crow never trusted a single point of failure. That included people. So he didn't build a network that knew the plan. He built a network that knew pieces. Each role was isolated. Each task was ordinary. Each participant believed they were solving a small, unrelated problem. No one could describe the whole. No one could betray what they didn't understand. That was the theory. The first node was legal, a restructuring firm that specialized in dissolving complexity quietly. They handled exits, mergers, dissolutions. No scandal, no drama. Their task was simple: prepare documents that would propagate instantly across jurisdictions once a death certificate appeared. They didn't ask whose death. They never did. The second node was medical. Not a conspiracy, just a sequence. One physician, one nurse, one protocol. No conversation, no deviation. Each believed the other had authorization from elsewhere. That was intentional. Authority, Elias knew, was most effective when it felt ambient. The third node was technological, a contractor who specialized in system redundancy. He was hired years earlier to design fail-safes for catastrophic leadership loss. War, kidnapping, death. The contractor built triggers that would revoke credentials, seal records, reassign permissions. He never questioned why the safeguards were so aggressive. He assumed paranoia. He wasn't wrong. Each node functioned perfectly on its own. Together, they formed something else entirely. A mechanism that could erase a man without declaring intent. Elias reviewed the structure repeatedly. He simulated leaks, human error, curiosity. The system tolerated mistakes. It did not tolerate connection. As long as no one joined the dots, the plan held. But networks evolve. People talk. Not about secrets, but about work. A lawyer mentions a clause that feels excessive. A technician notes a safeguard that seems unnecessary. A physician notices timing that feels precise. None of them say anything dangerous. But patterns don't require confession. They require proximity. Elias noticed the risk late. Too late to dismantle the structure. He saw it in the metadata, overlapping timestamps, coincident access logs, questions that weren't asked but were remembered. Someone in the network had begun to wonder. Not suspect. Wonder. That was worse. He considered shutting it down, replacing people, resetting roles. But that would create noise. Noise attracted scrutiny. So he did what he always did when systems reached instability. He introduced distance. Tasks were completed early. Communications were severed. Contracts were closed without renewal. The network dissolved quietly. Too quietly. After the death, most of the participants moved on. They processed what they had done as routine. Except one. A man who had not been paid to forget. A man whose role had required curiosity. He didn't know Elias Crow was alive. But he knew something had been orchestrated. And orchestration always left residue. Months later, long after the system had stabilized, the man opened an old archive. He wasn't looking for Elias. He was looking for proof that the world still behaved logically. Instead, he found a gap. A space where certainty should have been. And gaps, once noticed, invite attention. Elias Crow had designed a death that could be accepted. What he had not designed was a network that could forget forever. Because no system, no matter how elegant, can fully account for the human instinct to reconstruct meaning. And somewhere quietly, someone had begun to trace the outline of a man who was not supposed to exist anymore. Elias Crow had anticipated inconvenience. He had not anticipated absence. The first rule of staying dead was simple. Do nothing that suggested continuity. No routines. No habits. No preferences. He lived in places designed to be forgotten. Short-term rentals, transit zones, rooms that belonged to no one long enough to remember them. Every location had an expiration date. So did he. The second rule was harder. No interference. Elias watched the world he had shaped begin to move without him. Decisions were made differently. Some were worse. Some were better. Mistakes occurred that he could have prevented in minutes. He did nothing, because correction implied presence, and presence implied life. Staying dead required restraint far more difficult than control. Money was no longer power. It was liability. Accounts tied to him were sealed permanently, as planned. Shadow structures he had created for contingencies were inaccessible by design. He lived on funds he had once dismissed as insignificant, small enough not to attract interest, large enough to survive quietly. For the first time in decades, Elias calculated costs the way ordinary people did. Rent, food, time. Time was the most unsettling. He could not call anyone. No advisors. No contacts. Every voice he had once commanded was now a risk. Loneliness was not the price. Irrelevance was. News reached him slowly, filtered through public channels he had never paid attention to before. A merger he would have blocked went through. A reform he had quietly supported was reversed. An investigation he had delayed advanced without resistance. The institution adapted. It always would have. That realization hurt more than any loss of status. The most dangerous cost revealed itself weeks later. Memory. Without witnesses, Elias began to feel unreal even to himself. He avoided mirrors. Avoided photographs. He used a different name each time someone asked. Identity, he learned, was reinforced by repetition. Without it you thinned. One evening, in a city where no one knew him, Elias overheard two strangers discussing his death. They spoke casually, as history, a solved event. He was smart, one said. Too smart for his own good, the other replied. They moved on to another topic without pause. Elias remained seated long after they left. That was the moment he understood the full cost. Not fear, not loss. Replacement. The world had not only accepted his death, it had adjusted around it. Perfectly. The final rule revealed itself that night. If you stay dead long enough, you stop being the reason anything happens. You become background. A footnote. A closed file. Elias had designed his disappearance to outpace investigation. What he had not designed for was how quickly purpose eroded without friction. Survival was possible. Meaning was not guaranteed. And as weeks turned into months, Elias faced a question no system could answer for him. Was staying dead still a strategy, or had it become a sentence? The contradiction was small. So small it almost didn't matter. That was why it mattered. Julian Mercer had built a career on things other people ignored. He wasn't law enforcement. He wasn't intelligence. He didn't carry a badge or announce investigations. He was hired when institutions wanted reassurance without noise. Compliance failures. Financial anomalies. Uncomfortable questions no one wanted to ask out loud. Julian believed in one rule. If something doesn't need to exist, and yet it does, it's there for a reason. The Elias Crow file landed on his desk by accident. A post-mortem review. Routine. Boring. Already closed. Dead man. Clean death. No pending actions. Julian skimmed it once and would have moved on, except for a single line in the supplemental ledger. A payment. Small. Delayed. Issued 6 weeks after Crow's death. Not from a primary account. Not from anything obvious. From a dormant financial vehicle Crow had not touched in years. Julian paused. Dead men didn't authorize transactions. And automated systems didn't revive dormant assets without cause. That left only one explanation. Someone had moved it. Julian didn't escalate. Escalation created trails. Trails warned people. Instead, he copied the transaction ID and followed it sideways. Not forward. Backward. The payment wasn't illegal. That was the clever part. It had been structured years earlier, nested inside a contingency framework so old it had stopped triggering alerts. It wasn't fraud. It was residue. Something left behind when a system assumed a human was gone. Julian leaned back in his chair. Most analysts would have dismissed it as noise. He didn't. Because noise repeated randomly. This didn't. He pulled 5 more closed death cases from the same period. Executives. Founders. Men with complicated exits. None of them had post-mortem financial motion. Except Crow. Just one. Just enough. Julian's interest sharpened. He didn't need proof. He needed pattern pressure. So he waited. And the waiting paid him back. 2 weeks later, a second movement occurred. Different amount. Different channel. Same architecture. Julian didn't smile. He didn't frown. He opened a new folder and named it Crow, Post-Existence Activity. At this stage, Julian didn't believe Elias Crow was alive. That would have been absurd. What he believed was simpler and more dangerous. That someone had built a system so confident in death. It had forgotten how to close its own doors. And doors left open. Invited entry. Julian did not alert authorities. He did not inform the institution. He didn't even tell his client. Because once you said something out loud, you lost control of where it went. Instead, he made a single decision. He would reconstruct Elias Crow. From what still moved. After he was gone. Somewhere in a city Elias Crow had never planned to visit. He felt it before he understood it. A tightening. Not fear. Tension. The kind that didn't announce itself. Until it was already close. Elias Crow had lived by rules long enough to know which ones mattered. The most important rule of staying dead was simple. Never act in real time. Anything immediate could be traced. Anything reactive could be followed. So when the first financial movement surfaced weeks earlier, Elias had ignored it. He had watched the ripples settle and done nothing. That discipline had kept him invisible. Until the night the message arrived. It wasn't a call. Calls created witnesses. It was a line of text delivered through a channel that had not existed when Elias was alive. They're closing the northern accounts. Midnight. Elias read it once. Then again. The northern accounts weren't his. They weren't active. They weren't even valuable anymore. But they protected something else. A dependency. If they collapsed, a smaller institution, one Elias had quietly stabilized years earlier, would fall with them. People would lose jobs. Pensions would evaporate. A chain reaction would begin. None of it would be traced back to him. Unless he interfered. Elias stood still for a long time. This was not sentiment. This was causality. He had built the structure that would now fail cleanly. And he was the only one who could delay it. Just once. He broke the rule carefully. No new accounts. No direct contact. He accessed an old credential he had sworn never to touch again. One he had left active as a theoretical loophole. A mistake he had once considered harmless. He initiated a delay. 36 hours. Nothing more. The transaction was disguised as automated stabilization. Routine. Boring. Invisible. Except to someone who knew where to look. Julian Mercer noticed it immediately. Not because the action was large. Because it was timed. Automated systems didn't hesitate. They didn't delay with precision. They acted when thresholds were crossed. This delay had intent written all over it. Julian didn't move yet. He let the event breathe. Then he checked something most analysts never did. Latency. The delay had originated from a location not tied to any institution. Not domestic. Not foreign. Just undefined. Julian's pulse quickened, not from excitement, but confirmation. Back in his borrowed room, Elias shut the terminal down and wiped the session clean. He sat on the edge of the bed, hands resting on his knees. The delay had worked. The collapse would not happen tonight. But something else had. He felt it then. That tightening again. Closer this time. Not attention. Interest. Someone had seen the hand behind the curtain. Julian opened a second folder beneath the first. He didn't label it with a name. Names made things personal. He labeled it with a phrase. Active intervention. That was enough. Elias had broken the rule for a reason he could justify. That didn't matter. Systems didn't care why. Neither did hunters. Because the moment a dead man interferes with the living world, he stops being a theory and becomes a target. Julian Mercer did not hurry. Hurrying made patterns visible. Instead, he slowed everything down. He mapped the delay Elias had introduced not as an event, but as a decision. Decisions left geometry behind, angles, constraints, preferences. The delay hadn't come from where money usually moved. It came from where intervention was cheapest. That told Julian something important. Whoever had acted was not rich in access anymore. They were conserving it. Julian traced the latency through infrastructure layers most analysts ignored. Not accounts. Not banks. Routing behavior. The request had passed through a relay network designed for privacy, not speed. Old. Under-maintained. The kind used by people who preferred not to be noticed but also didn't expect pursuit. That narrowed the field. Not intelligence. Not criminals. Someone technical enough to disappear, but human enough to make trade-offs. He didn't notify anyone. No warrants. No subpoenas. Sirens warned prey. Julian preferred silence. Across the city, Elias felt the walls shift. Not closing. Aligning. Internet connections that once felt neutral now lagged unpredictably. Cafes he had used once no longer worked twice. Rental hosts canceled without explanation. Coincidence piled up too neatly. He changed locations twice in a single day. That helped. Briefly. Julian noticed the movement by its absence. The delay Elias had caused did not repeat. No second correction. No further intervention. That restraint confirmed what Julian already suspected. The subject knew he had been seen. Julian began to hunt negatively. He listed everything Elias wasn't doing. No large transactions. No new digital footprints. No social contact. Which meant Elias was close. Invisible men didn't travel far. They hid in places where anonymity was ordinary. Julian selected 5 cities. Not because they were important, but because they were forgettable. Places where a man could exist without being observed, and still have access to infrastructure when needed. He didn't check records. He waited. Elias made another mistake. A small one. He reused a pattern. Not a credential. A sequence. The way he staged access checks before acting. The way he waited precisely long enough to confirm stability. Julian recognized it instantly. Because he had designed systems too. And systems always betrayed their creators through habit. Julian smiled for the first time. Not with satisfaction. With certainty. He didn't move toward Elias. He moved ahead of him. Identified the next place Elias would feel safe. Prepared nothing. Set no traps. Just arrived early. Elias entered the space that evening believing it untouched. The room was clean. The signals quiet. But something felt wrong. Not watched. Expected. He left immediately. Too late. Julian stood across the street, watching the exit Elias didn't use. No binoculars. No devices raised. Just a man observing the way another man avoided being seen. That was enough. Julian updated the file. Not with a name. Not yet. With a single line. Subject confirmed mobile. Intent, preserve invisibility. Error rate, increasing. The chase did not need sirens. It needed patience. And patience was something Julian had plenty of. Somewhere between two trains, Elias realized the truth. Staying dead was no longer about silence. It was about outpacing understanding. And someone was beginning to understand him very well. Recognition did not come with confrontation. It came with alignment. Elias Crow felt it in a place he had once trusted. A pause that lasted half a second too long. A door that closed without urgency. A face that did not look twice, but did not need to. He had spent years designing systems that could sense imbalance. Now he was inside one, and someone else was tuning it. Julian Mercer did not follow Elias anymore. Following implied distance. He moved instead along Elias's logic. He studied the choices Elias avoided, the exits he never took, the timing he respected even when it cost him. This wasn't fear. It was discipline. And discipline always belonged to someone who had once been powerful. The recognition happened in a public space. Not a meeting room. Not a hidden corridor. A place where no one expected danger because nothing ever happened there. A transit hub. Crowded. Loud. Anonymous. Perfect. Elias stood near the platform edge, eyes scanning not for faces, but for behavior. Who lingered too long. Who moved without destination. Who wasn't waiting for anything. He spotted Julian immediately. Not because Julian stood out. Because Julian didn't. Julian felt it at the same moment. The sudden absence of uncertainty. The quiet certainty that the shape he had been tracing now had edges. They did not look at each other. They didn't need to. The space between them compressed, not physically but cognitively. Two systems acknowledging overlap. Julian boarded the train. Elias did not. That was the signal. Julian stepped off at the next stop. Elias exited 2 stations later. They were now playing the same game. Julian sent a message through a channel Elias could still access. Not a threat. Not a demand. Just information. You built something elegant. It just wasn't finished. Elias read it once. Then deleted it. Then smiled. Not because he was amused. Because for the first time since his death, he was no longer alone in the architecture. That night, Elias changed his behavior deliberately. He let Julian see one thing he had been hiding. A trace. Not enough to expose him. Enough to invite pursuit. Recognition worked both ways. If Julian was going to hunt him, Elias would choose where. Julian understood the invitation immediately. He didn't resist it. He respected it. Because men who design traps deserve to choose the terrain where they fall. From that moment on, the chase stopped being about discovery. It became about timing. Who would move first? Who would wait too long? Who would miscalculate? Elias had stayed dead by remaining silent. Julian had found him by listening. Now both men understood the same truth. The system was no longer the danger. They were. And only one of them could decide how this ended. Elias Crow stopped running the moment he understood something Julian had not yet accepted. Julian was hunting a man. Elias was thinking in systems. That difference mattered. The first move Elias made was not visible. He didn't flee the city. Didn't burn identities. Didn't vanish deeper. He did the opposite. He stayed. Stability created confidence. Confidence bred impatience. Julian felt the change almost immediately. The signals Elias had leaked stopped appearing. No new traces. No missteps. Just absence. That was dangerous. Silence, when it followed invitation, meant recalibration. Elias reopened a framework he had sealed years earlier. Not financial. Not medical. Procedural. A dormant compliance engine designed to test integrity under extreme stress. It had never been deployed fully because it was invasive. It didn't look for crime. It looked for overreach. Anyone who tried to bend process to accelerate truth would trigger it, including investigators. Especially investigators. Julian noticed resistance where there had been none. Requests stalled. Cross-checks looped back. Third-party confirmations began contradicting each other. Not errors. Counterweights. Someone had reintroduced friction. Julian adjusted. He bypassed formality and went analog. Interviews. Patterns. Behavior. That was when Elias made his second move. A document surfaced. Not leaked. Discovered. A sealed audit Elias had commissioned long before his death. One that examined the very compliance ecosystem Julian operated inside. It didn't accuse. It mapped incentives. Conflicts of interest. Career accelerants. Quiet quid pro quos that sat comfortably inside legality. The audit wasn't about Julian, but it was about people like him. Julian read it in silence. Not alarmed. Interested. Elias was no longer hiding. He was educating. That night, Julian received another message. Shorter this time. You're very good at finding what shouldn't exist. But you're standing inside something that does. Julian didn't respond. He didn't need to. He finally understood the shift. This was no longer a chase. It was a test. Elias wasn't trying to survive. He was trying to see how far Julian would go. How much process he would bend. How many shortcuts he would justify. How much certainty he would manufacture. Because Elias knew the rule better than anyone. The moment you violate a system to expose it, you become part of its failure. Julian felt the pressure build, not from above, but around him. Colleagues hesitated. Superiors asked cautious questions. Reviews were requested and delayed. The same tactics Julian had once used on others were now touching him lightly. Not accusing. Measuring. Julian smiled. Not because he was winning. Because he had found a worthy opponent. Elias watched from a distance that no longer felt like hiding. He had turned the system back on, not to erase himself, but to mirror Julian's methods. The trap had not been built to kill. It had been built to reveal. And now, the final question remained. Would Julian step back? Once he realized the ground was unstable, or would he push forward and prove Elias right? Julian Mercer had always believed that truth justified method. It was the quiet creed of people who worked in shadows. Find the flaw. Expose it. Let the system correct itself. What Elias Crow had done was force that belief into daylight. The final signal arrived without drama. Not a leak. Not an accusation. A procedural notice. Julian's access was temporarily limited pending internal review. Routine language. Neutral tone. But the reason cited made his chest tighten. Process acceleration without oversight. Julian read it twice. Then a third time. He had pushed. He had bypassed. He had justified it as necessary. And now the same system he trusted was asking him to explain himself. Julian understood the elegance of it immediately. Elias hadn't exposed him. He had let Julian expose himself. Julian could still finish this. He knew where Elias would surface next. He had enough fragments to force confrontation. He could escalate publicly, burn the ground. But escalation would require shortcuts. Shortcuts would confirm the audit. Across the city, Elias waited. Not hidden. Not moving. Waiting was no longer avoidance. It was an invitation. Julian sat alone long after the office emptied. He imagined the headlines. The recognition. the vindication. Then he imagined the review boards, the questions, the permanent mark beside his name. A man who bent process to prove a point. The irony settled in slowly. Julian closed the file. He archived the Crow folder. Not erased. Not destroyed. Sealed. He submitted a single line in the system before shutting down his terminal. Irregularities noted. Insufficient cause for continuation. It was not a lie. It was restraint. The next morning, Elias Crow read the update from a public terminal. No message. No acknowledgement. Just absence. The system exhaled again. Elias did not return to the world. He didn't reclaim power. Didn't correct outcomes. He had proven what he needed to prove. That systems designed to eliminate dominance would eventually demand humility from everyone inside them, including their enforcers. Weeks later, Elias left the city. No urgency. No disguise. Just movement. He carried nothing that could trace him backward. For the first time since his death, he wasn't running from attention. He was walking toward obscurity. Julian Mercer continued his work. More carefully. More slowly. He never spoke of Elias Crow again. But sometimes, when a case felt too clean, too certain, he hesitated, and that hesitation changed outcomes. Somewhere between departure and disappearance, Elias allowed himself one thought. He had not escaped the system. He had completed it, and that was enough.